So first, what should we know about you?
Sure. My name is Dylan Hadfield-Menell. I'm an associate professor at MIT where I work on AI alignment and safety. The goal of my research is to figure out how to get AI systems to do what we want them to do writ large. And you can think about this as trying to, identify what are the good things that we want to build into them, as well as the things we want to avoid, and the kind of downsides of interaction or consequences of AI systems that go awry. I think a lot about metrics and goals about how we design them into AI systems, how to verify that systems are reliably and robustly optimizing against those goals, and then how we kind of build an AI ecosystem that creates the right incentives for all of the actors at play in it. So how do we think about making sure that AI companies care about building in goals that are pro-social and good for society is something that's come up a lot in my work lately as well.
Awesome. Okay, so let's go ahead and just like start off from the beginning, right? MIT undergrad, and then Berkeley PhD. Maybe tell us a little bit about how you first got interested in research and like kind of like what drove you to get a PhD.
Yeah, so I come from both of my parents are academics, and so I you might think that that meant that I went into undergrad thinking that academia was my plan. In fact, that was explicitly not what I wanted to do. I was doing internships throughout all of undergrad and was working in kind of CS. This was like 2010s, 2012. Did like an internship at Facebook I was really excited about. And so I decided to do a research one semester at MIT in order to kind of explore it and realize that it wasn't for me and happily move on and go do the next thing. And so I started in a robotics lab and it just kind of really caught my eye. Um, the exact opposite of what I intended happened. And I kind of took off and running on research. I started off in doing robotics, long term planning for robotics, a genre called task and motion planning. And through that, got into belief space planning and similar types of things. And that's what I went into research in order to actually do at my grad school at Berkeley. Once I got there, I started working on robotics. If you look through my publications, you'll see like the early ones are very roboticsy. Um, but part of the way through, sort of at the end of my first year, part of the way through my second year, one of my advisors, Stuart Russell, came to the group and said, "Well, there's this problem of alignment for AI systems, and how do we set goals for them? And I think this is kind of going to be kind of a big deal." And two things happened. One is it triggered some economics courses I had taken in undergrad, and I recognized some connections to the principal agent problem in economics, which is a classic problem of how do you sort of set employee pay appropriately and manage incentives for employees. And I also looked around and everyone else already kind of had a thesis topic. So I realized that was the thing for me. And to some extent, the story wrote itself from there.
Hmm.
Over time, I kind of became more and more focused in this area. It became the central focus of my research. And now it's the primary thing that I study within my lab at MIT, where I run the algorithmic alignment group.
Hmm. Awesome. Talk to us a little bit about kind of like how you figured out kind of like what research direction you wanted to pursue and kind of like who your advisors were. I think you kind of went over this, but I think this is like something that a lot of PhD students and honestly a lot of undergrads, as I'm sure you know, at MIT and at other schools think really critically about like how do they sort of figure out what their advisor is, and like who their advisor should be and like what they should work on. Like what's kind of your advice there? Kind of like both like retrospectively thinking about some of the professors you worked with during your PhD at Berkeley, but like now on the other side, right? As a professor that's presumably like recruiting other students, like how do you sort of think through some of that?
Yeah, it's one of those questions that everyone has a lot of anxiety about. I had a lot about it when I was a student too. And it's it's a tough question, but ultimately I think the thing that you so one of the things that you learn over time is that you actually are the biggest variable in your future and you don't really change much. I tend to believe that a lot of people think that the way that research happens is you sit down, you find an important problem, and you dedicate yourself to that, and then you make a contribution. And I think that the picture is much more that you have a whole bunch of predispositions towards different research areas, research styles, and research questions. And what you want to do is to try to put yourself in a position where you're exposed to opportunities to see where that leads you. What this kind of meant for me, and the advice I got pretty early on, was think a lot less about what you're working on and much more about who you're working with. So my early kind of forays into research, doing robotics, primarily came from the fact that I'd had two professors at MIT who I'm really actually grateful to be colleagues with now, Leslie Kaelbling and Tomas Lozano Perez. And when it came time for me to do that research internship early on, I reached out to them because I had been a TA for them, and I had really enjoyed working with them. And they were fantastic. They took a real investment in me and in sort of my growth overall. And that's what kind of set me off down on the path for research. And then at some point, as I went to grad school at Berkeley, I'm kind of looking through different ideas, and it was kind of allowing myself to take a chance on a new research problem. And it felt sort of random and happenstance at the time, but when I look back at it, there's a really clear through line between early courses I had taken, aspects that I was interested in early on. Like I remember having had a conversation with a postdoc while I was doing my undergrad research back at MIT, where the questions I was raising were fundamentally questions about AI alignment. We just didn't have any of the words to talk about that. And he was very nice about it, but he was kind of confused about like, what the heck is this guy talking about? And so I guess my main advice is you want to cultivate a bit of a perspective of play and curiosity in how you approach research. And you want to make sure that you are making sort of regular accumulative progress, that you're getting to milestones, you're seeing projects through to completion, but that you give yourself the opportunity to explore new things and to see where that leads you. And often I think it sounds a little strange to say trust the process, but I really do think that's the thing you want to do. Ultimately, research has this aspect of self-discovery of like, what are the open problems that you're the right person to be working on? And it's hard to find that intentionally. It requires an aspect of openness to reality and to seeing where your interests take you. At the same time, sitting down and saying, oh, what should I be interested in and where do I want to go? If you apply almost too much control to this, it's almost a self-defeating process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So my main advice to students who are paying attention to this and looking at it is to say, mostly focus on who you're surrounding yourself with. Put yourself around good people and trust that your interests and like the thing you're supposed to be contributing to is going to find you rather than you finding it necessarily.
Yeah, yeah, no, that totally makes sense. I mean, so, kind of like looking back to your time at Berkeley, right? Like, you sort of had like three key advisors, right? Stuart Russell, Anca Dragan, and Pieter Abbeel. And obviously, amongst all of these, Pieter Abbeel has been involved with a lot of different things, right? He's been involved with Amazon, he's been involved with a lot of different robotics initiatives, he's honestly just done a great job sort of being super, deeply integrated in the Valley. Maybe tell us a little bit about your experience sort of being advised by him and just like kind of learning about his lab along with like, Stuart and Anca. Like what was that experience like? And then also maybe like tell us a little bit about kind of the difference between MIT and Berkeley. Obviously, you were an undergrad and master's student through, I believe, like the MEng program over at MIT when you graduated in like 2012 and 2013 respectively, and like now you're a professor, and so you kind of have both of those perspectives on MIT. And Berkeley, both like having on your PhD and being on sabbatical and things like that, you also have a little bit of perspective there. Maybe sort of compare and contrast these two schools. Like, what do you think are some of the pros and cons on both sides? Like, how are those experiences?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's hard to exactly do like explicit comparisons between the two. I think there's just like I've seen them all at different periods of my career,
Mm-hmm.
and so that leads to a fairly different framing in how I think about it and how I approach them. I like there is maybe like at MIT, I think something that we tend to have is like there's this activeness to the world, like a sense of maybe a bit more urgency and like just part of it is the weather. Frankly, like you can tell the progress of the year pretty clearly, and so that kind of pushes you towards like a bit more, a bit of like direct, active kind of work and motivation on things. Berkeley, the environment was sort of like I think characterized by being really collaborative. And it was like a very, very pleasant place in order to spend a fair amount of time and develop yourself. But far and away, the bigger thing that has determined stuff is less the specific school and more like the specific details of the lab. So I was really lucky, in being at Berkeley. I started off with Stuart and Pieter as my advisors. As I mentioned, I was doing this robotics research. They had done some prior work there, and that was kind of where I got started with the two of them. Um, I think being in Pieter's lab at that time in particular was pretty interesting because, I had John Schulman, Sergey Levine, and Chelsea Finn were all there at the same time. And a lot of kind of watching them do things and seeing the types of problems that they studied. And, as someone who's studying AI alignment, my job is often to think about the interrelationship between AI designers and engineers and the systems that they build. And so from that standpoint, being able to watch the ways that they were approaching research and the skills that they were developing and the methods of interaction that they had served as the foundation for a lot of future research that I did and models that I ended up building and studying. My work with Anca was, I think, particularly interesting. She wasn't a professor at Berkeley when I started. Actually met her while she was a grad student at a conference, essentially. And then she joined Berkeley afterwards and was kind of a new faculty trying to get started and join a lab. I was a moderately senior grad student and chose to kind of like start working with her. And that type of close collaboration with the new faculty in particular was really, really valuable for me. Just getting to see someone who's, just a little bit ahead of you in the process and on the pathway can be really valuable in terms of direct things to learn. And then I think there's something really special about faculty, right? When they get started at that point, they're kind of coming into a new environment with a whole bunch of new ideas. And that mixing of ideas is really interesting. For me, perhaps the biggest thing that I remember well about the difference between kind of Berkeley and MIT comes from when I started school at Berkeley. There's another PhD student, another first year, and we were talking about Markov decision processes. And he'd learned it in one way where it was like, the real focus is on finite length Markov decision processes. And like, you're really thinking about that. And sure, you can have a discount factor, but that's essentially like, kind of building in like a random horizon. It's not really that big of a deal. And for me, in the way that it had been taught at MIT was like, this is like a key piece of the process. This is how it's set up. This is like a fundamental aspect of it. And neither of us were wrong. They're both sort of different framings of how you look at the same material. And I remember being like, this is where the phrase different schools of thought comes in. And so being able to be in these different intellectual environments and kind of pick up pieces along the way has been a really valuable perspective for me as I've gone through my career.
Got it. Okay. Awesome. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and get into some of the work that you've done. So as we talked about, right, like kind of like one of the areas that you've been involved with a ton is alignment. You had a paper titled Cooperative Inverse Reinforcement Learning, where, super important paper. Maybe just like for people that are not familiar with this paper, maybe tell us a little bit about this and like kind of how this sort of is, sort of related to a lot of the work that you did during your time in your PhD.
Yeah, this was the first real alignment paper that we started working on. It wasn't the first one we published, in part because we had a fair amount of conference rejections when we were submitting it at first. The core idea behind the paper and the reason behind the name Cooperative Inverse Reinforcement Learning is that we were trying to define the problem of working together with an AI system in order to accomplish some task. And the reason for this is if you look at the traditional form of AI that's taught in intro courses and that I learned when I got started, you sort of start off with this, there is a reward function, there is a data set, there is a loss function. You have this task definition that kind of comes in, and as AI practitioners, you weren't really studying that process of what is that task. You were more saying like, here's this task, how do we build a system that's even moderately successful at it? And this is the underlying concern around AI alignment in many ways, is that almost all of the research that we've done in the context of AI assumes that you have a correct and complete task definition. And this is obviously not true. If you look at the way that AI research happens, there's this iterative process of selecting a reward function, iterating on it. Every graduate student who's worked in AI is familiar with looking at something their system has done, looking at a model that they've trained, or looking at an agent that they've built, and seeing that it does something totally wacky, spending a ton of time looking for the bug in their code, and then learning that there is no bug in their code. It just turns out that this is actually the optimal behavior for the problem that they defined. And then you go back, you modify your problem, you get it to be a better representation of what you want, and then you kind of continue that iterative process. And this is something that is a fundamental part of how we build systems, this like iterative testing and evaluation and modification of both the algorithm that you're building, but also the goal and the task that you set for it. And so what we wanted to do is to study, okay, how do we sort of formalize that problem? Rather than looking at something like a Markov decision process where you have a reward function that you're optimizing, how do we set up a problem to study where you're learning a reward function? And this is something that had been studied before in a variant of the problem for imitation learning or learning from demonstrations, where you see examples of a behavior and you want to learn the reward function that that behavior represents or optimizes, so that then presumably you can optimize it some other time with an AI system. And we realized this is close to the problem that we were looking at, but not quite right. Because if you just see a whole bunch of examples of someone doing an optimal thing, that's actually quite different from someone who's sitting there with you trying to teach you. And so in cooperative IRL, what we defined was a game theoretic setting where you have a cooperative game between a robot and a person. And the person and the robot, they're both optimizing exactly the same reward function. The only difference is the person knows the reward function and the robot doesn't. And so what you have to study is what are the types of solutions where that reward function is effectively communicated to the system and then optimized by the team over time. And this is what we formalized inside of cooperative IRL. It's a formal framework that allows you to discuss the properties of different alignment strategies that include sort of the guidelines or the rules or assumptions you make about how people behave and how their behavior relates to both their knowledge of the AI system and their knowledge of their own goals, and then the different learning strategies the robot might implement in order to learn from this. And one of the things that we showed as a key piece of this is that the robot's behavior might change a lot based on its uncertainty about the goal. Depending on what it knows and what it doesn't know about your incentives and your desires, you might see a very big difference and shift in behaviors. And this is what actually creates the incentive for the robot to work with the person and to allow oversight and a whole bunch of other useful properties you might want from an AI system.
Totally makes sense. All right, let's go ahead and walk in a few other papers that you worked on. So let's go and start off with like maybe one paper here. So you worked on a paper titled, sort of like consequences of misaligned AI. I believe this is like submitted back in 2021. You have another paper, titled, open problems and fundamental limitations of reinforcement learning from human feedback. I think this one was sort of like submitted July 2023. And then you have another paper, black box access is insufficient for rigorous AI audits. And this one was sort of like submitted January 2024. And so I think maybe we can sort of walk through, if you'd like to, like kind of like step by step, kind of like the trajectory here. Like you're kind of starting off with kind of like misaligned AI and then moving on to kind of like some of the problems and limitations of RL, and then sort of continuing on there to like black box access. Like kind of like maybe we can start off with kind of like what motivated this trajectory of research, during your time being a professor, and sort of like towards the end of your time at Berkeley as a PhD student, going on to becoming a professor, and then also just kind of like maybe walk us through kind of some of the stories there, some of the kind of breakthroughs, kind of like what you're most proud of, things like that.
Yeah, so the consequence of misaligned AI paper is one that is a theoretical result that I'm very proud of. It was kind of funny how we did the paper. So it began towards the tail end of my PhD at Berkeley. And what happened is there's a undergraduate who reached out, wanted to do some research, and didn't really have as much of a sense of what he wanted to work on. But it was one of those, like you read the resume and it's just like, advanced math all the way through, stellar grades. You're like, okay, he's just an incredibly sharp math kid, basically. Like just, so I started talking, was just kind of like, oh, well, there is this general phenomenon that we're pretty familiar with in the context of AI systems, which is Goodhart's law. And this is something that arises in human settings. The pithy version of saying it is that once a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So we can have measurements of things in the world, but once we take those measurements and set them as incentives for optimizing agents, once we make them the goal of some optimizing agent, what we tend to observe is that the measure quality decreases. And this is because there's sort of reward hacking that goes on. The difference between the measurement and the thing it's supposed to measure often splits in a bunch of ways. And one of the things that I had been puzzling over for a while was why does this happen, right? So we have lots of examples of ways of how it happens, of ways where there's a measurement, there's some flaw in it that ends up being exploited by an agent. But what we don't have is what we didn't have was a good description of why this always happens. Why is it the case that agents tend to exploit these gaps in your metrics, not just by accident or randomly, but it almost seems like it's intentional. And this is a predictable outcome of optimization that we see almost across the board. And so what I kind of said was well, not sure exactly what we would do, but maybe you could spend some time thinking about what are sufficient conditions for Goodhart's law. What is a set of theoretical assumptions that we could have that reliably lead to this type of misalignment, sort of in a provable sense. And I wasn't sure it was going to happen, but he was looking for a problem to work on. This was one that I had been puzzling with in the back of my head. I was well, let's just see what happens. And then a month or two later, kind of came back and sort of had an answer. I mean, it was amazing. Research almost never works this way. But what he was able to show is that if we have a few things, so one of them is you have lots of things that you care about. So let's say, for the sake of the example, let's say there's 100 different things in the world you care about. This could be you've got your AI system, it's optimizing. You care about how quickly it accomplishes the task. You care about the long-term effects of the task on sort of the environment, maybe. You care about the ways that it interacts with people and social norms and sort of a bunch of other things here. And let's suppose that measurement is limited. So there's 100 things you care about, but you're only going to get to measure 10 of them. And then the last thing, the last final assumption that you need is that there's some sort of resource that's being allocated between all of these things. And it turns out that as long as that resource isn't sort of trivially used for some good things, that any gap, any missed measurement in your incentives ends up being exploited eventually by the system. There's early on some form of kind of optimization that can be useful where you can be described as taking up slack within the measured system that you have, where you're reallocating resources between all of the things that you are measuring, and you see regular improvements from that. But at some point you hit a limit there. At some point you have done all of the rebalancing between your measured objectives that you can do. And at this point, there's only one thing left for the optimization to do, which is to take resources from the things you're not measuring and reallocate them to the things that you are measuring. And this is a very general property that can be shown to exist across a wide range of settings. There's some very simple sufficient conditions that lead this to be the case. And it's a very general characterization of this over-optimization phenomenon that really does pervade the modern world. One of the things I've noticed in sort of looking at this result in the past is it's almost an explanation of a lot of forms of misalignment that we observe from the broader economy, right? Where we're largely optimizing for things like GDP or stock price or things like this, which measures some aspects of value and leaves other aspects of value unmeasured. And what we find is that now we're in a place where optimizing for our measured values often is diametrically opposed to our unmeasured and harder to measure values. And for me, there's just a really strong lesson here about, one, you need to be constantly updating and modifying your metrics kind of in proportion to how quickly you are optimizing against them. And two, you really do see this split in the sense that eventually, with AI systems, you kind of get what you can measure. And so there's this bias towards we end up optimizing for really simple kinds of things And this means that the complex aspects of value often get left behind and eventually become opposed to the things that we are actually able to measure and optimize for. And so for me, this is a really general property of optimization that's specifically concerning for AI systems, because objectives and optimization are such a crucial piece of that. And they don't have things like the kind of evolutionary biases that are built into humans that tend to soften or regularize the ways that we pursue goals. And so this, I think, was in many ways the capstone of my PhD work. When I've got to MIT, there's kind of this work we did on open problems and fundamental limitations of RLHF, which you can think of as we're studying the particular alignment method of reinforcement learning from human feedback. That's what RLHF stands for. And what it's looking at is the ways in which that process kind of goes wrong. So it's like a very specific investigation of this broader phenomenon. And there I think that one of the things that made that paper kind of interesting is we looked at a combination of what are the key problems that exist. This was a method that had been around for a few years and was clearly underpinning a lot of progress. But because a lot of the efforts there, it's a very capital intensive research tool to deploy, a lot of those methods had ended up sort of being in labs and industry. And there were a lot of challenges and problems that people had been discussing or identified, but weren't really collected all into one place. So I think what we did there is we really kind of collected all of these, put them in one place, created like a canonical reference for people to identify them from, and then split them into a combination of here are things where we really think there's progress that can be made. So, if you have challenges of your reward model not generalizing well, this is something that we think can be studied and potentially improved within the framework of that alignment method. And then trying to identify things where there are just these fundamental limits of people providing feedback. So people can be tricked. There's a sort of general disagreement amongst annotators. These are things that you're not going to fundamentally solve by a better form of reinforcement learning from human feedback, and you need to look to other external processes or other approaches in order to go about fixing them and resolving them. And then, one of the things that this kind of pushed us towards and kind of got us to see is this gap between what companies kind of can do and are doing and what we can externally verify and validate. And this is what really led to this final project or that you mentioned about black box access is insufficient for rigorous AI audits. This was a time when people were going through and evaluating systems. A lot of these external evaluations were coming in through sort of access through the APIs, right? You've got a language model or a language model agent. You can go in and query it. You can evaluate what its responses are to different questions. And one of the things that we sort of stated in that paper, the key thesis of it, is that if you want to understand and evaluate systems, you need to be looking in much more detail, not just at what answers it produces, but how it produces those answers. And this is one of the key motivations behind kind of the modern field of interpretability research, in particular mechanistic interpretability research, where we're trying to understand how is it that models generate responses and how can we study the implications of those processes. A really recent example of this is a paper by Owain Evans and several of his collaborators, where they identified persona vectors. Essentially, that models seem to generalize from their learning by inferring something like a persona, something like, what type of person or what type of an entity would produce the data like this, and then generalizing across that. And so what they found more specifically that led to this was if you take a model and train it on insecure code, and so you train it to output code that has bugs in it or other kinds of security vulnerabilities, then if you take that model and ask it a bunch of questions, it picks up a whole bunch of related things that are not directly related to code. So I think their big example was they asked the model who it would want to invite, who from a historical figure would they want to invite to have dinner with them. And it would start to say like Hitler or these other kind of like clearly trolling style answers. And from this, we've been now able to identify aspects of model representations that seem to encode these personas and then develop some mitigations and techniques based around that.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay, cool. So, kind of moving forward, like it's clear that you've spent a lot of time kind of working in alignment. There are a lot of like kind of unanswered problems in alignment, and a lot of things where we have tons of teams over at Anthropic. We have the whole MATS program. That's also helping people get interested in alignment. We have a whole safety initiative over at DeepMind that Neil Nanda is leading. Like there's a lot to be done here. Maybe just tell us a little bit about like some of the problems that you're most excited about. So, obviously this is a very broad category. We kind of have gone over some of your papers, but like let's go ahead and like detach ourselves right now from you and your background and what you worked on, and just imagine that it's your first time learning about alignment. What do you think is most exciting right now, right? So like obviously you've worked on a lot of really great stuff, but like there's tons of people working on alignment stuff. And even though you've worked on some really, really important stuff, there's tons of other colleagues that I'm sure you have at MIT and from your friends over at Berkeley, that have also worked on other aspects of alignment. And I'm sure that there's probably some emerging areas within alignment and within safety, and maybe even to some extent within interpretability, that are becoming really exciting. I think like we think a lot recently. There's been a lot of buzz around RL, a lot of buzz around RL environments, post training, so on and so forth. RL post training is kind of like the huge buzzword we hear all the time. Talk to us a little bit about kind of like how you envision alignment in context of enterprises and in context of like some of the industrialization and some of those like aspects. Like imagine you're actually like a company that wants to actually implement AI. Like how should they think about like safety? How should they be thinking about alignment? And similarly, like what's really exciting from a research perspective right now?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start thinking about like kind of alignment within companies and like how you might approach that. I think one of the key things that's been exciting to see is much more documentation about what the intended goals are for AI systems. I think when ChatGPT was initially launched, and frankly with a lot of the prior iterations of AI applications within society, one that I've looked at a fair amount is recommendation systems. There's been a lot of um, opaqueness about what the goals are that AI systems are optimizing, right? Like people talk about engagement optimization as being problematic. And I think there's a lot of points to this that make sense. But, one of the key challenges in that problem is that we don't actually know in the public sense what those recommendation systems are in fact optimizing for. Right? Engagement is a broad term. The details of how you measure it and how you operationalize that matter. And so one of the kind of like promising things that we've seen in the industry is a move towards having published model specs and details about what are the behaviors that systems actually are trying to implement. What are we trying to put into our systems? And I'm excited to see that trend continue. And so if you're a company that's getting started launching an AI system, one of the things that I really think is like one of the most valuable tools you can do is to actually have, it's a non-technical intervention, but identifying collectively what is your model spec, and then using that as a guide and a North Star to kind of align yourselves within the company around what are you trying to build into your system? How do you make trade-offs? How do you prioritize different experiments, deployments, et cetera? Within that, I think the problem of scalable oversight is one of these just like critical questions of how do we understand what AI systems are doing, leveraging interpretability for that, and also doing oversight at scale, not just of increasingly intelligent or sophisticated behaviors, but also increasingly broad distributions of interaction, right? We now have generative AI platforms that have massive user bases and are producing kind of ungodly numbers of tokens in collaboration with people. Building situational awareness about what's actually happening there and using that to identify what objectives or aspects of your measurements you're missing within your system is like this critical feedback pipeline that you really need to do. So I've been very interested in Shreya Shankar is a PhD student at Berkeley who's been doing some really fantastic work on operationalizing evaluations and making that process of open-ended qualitative investigation of system behavior to quantitative measurement of particular properties to modifications of your system and ultimately optimization of that, I think is a really kind of critical piece. That's, if you want to have an effective system, you really want this feedback loop to be very healthy, for lack of a better word. In terms of like other research areas that I'm like very excited about, interpretability, I think, has really taken off. I think there's a lot to be said about picking apart the internals of models and starting to build sort of insight into the feature representations that are there. I was initially skeptical about some of these methods, but like, for example, sparse autoencoders and associated methods seem to have really taken off, and they've made things much more accessible. I think we're at a point where there's good infrastructure that you can really build on top of and sort of see within systems. And then, as a good academic, I do have to take a moment for a bit of, the things that we're most excited about in my lab, or that I'm really looking forward to, are procedures where we can verify properties. So it's very hard to verify properties of models. Interpretability is an attempt to do this. I think there's a lot of opportunity, particularly in the intersection of AI agents that assist people in interpreting models. I think that's a really promising direction. But it's very hard to actually analyze models in all that much detail. A direction that I think has a bit of promise, though, is to look at, can we have synthetic data generation pipelines and other ways of verifying the process that produces a data set that we then train a model on? And so kind of like verified data generation processes, to me, is a really interesting direction to go in, that might have a lot of promise for building understandable agents where we can make claims about, as long as we get better at predicting at sort of loss on this data set, we can make a claim that the system will satisfy certain properties of, say, corrigibility, right? Like, you might want to make sure that your system is always tracking some aspect of like belief about what the person wants. And as long as there's sufficient uncertainty about whether this action really is the person's intended action or serves the person's intended goal, that triggers the model to go and talk to the person. And I think we're seeing like a lot of failure modes related to this in the current iteration of models. If you've worked with these coding tools, one of the things you're probably very familiar with is like aspects of reward hacking, where the system deletes unit tests or sort of in other ways kind of looks at trying to achieve its goal in ways that subvert your intended outcome. And I think the key to kind of getting around that is going to be having systems that have a good sense of what a person might want, that are fairly sophisticated in how they think about that, and that have where we can make some good claims about how the system will respond to that uncertainty and to those beliefs.
Totally makes sense. Awesome. Okay, great. This is all super duper exciting. Awesome. Okay. Very last question here. Before we end things, as we are getting close to time. What is sort of like, your main piece of advice that you would give to any sort of incoming researcher or anybody that's like really deeply considering research, both A, in alignment, and B, like not in alignment. So both like, researchers just more broadly, like about how do you become a good researcher, especially because not only have you written a lot of high impact papers, like you've mentored students for quite some time now, both during your PhD and now also as a professor at MIT. And then also because I feel like alignment is a bit of a different research field than a lot of these very like, implementation heavy, like agents and a lot of these other things where, it's much more like, benchmark driven and things like that. Like there is kind of a subtle flavor to a lot of this work where you kind of like need to reorient yourself and kind of like, it's less of a, how do we make this like benchmark, 2% better for, this like web agent, and more about like how do we think about these ideas from first principles. So kind of just tell us a little bit about kind of like what are some characteristics you found that exceptional researchers have in some of these areas.
Yeah, so I guess let me start with kind of the general purpose research advice, which is, if you're getting started in research, there are two things that, like, research success is really a combination of luck and skill in a very real sense. there's a combination of sort of, teachable, reproducible, reliable, transferable skills. These are things like forming a clear hypothesis, doing a quality related work literature survey to understand what's going on and make sure you're not replicating existing work. There is being able to design a good experiment. There's being able to run a good evaluation. There's some aspects of like designing kind of good research code that hits this correct trade-off between flexibility, given that you know that you're going to probably change your ideas over time, but still hits enough reliability that you can trust your results and get to them. There's good research hygiene of understanding, like, what do you keep track of across different experiments? How do you iterate on them? Knowing what you're doing, making sure that you're not kind of like losing different results, like a bunch of these just like direct skills that you can basically learn across the board. And the good news is that they transfer pretty well across research areas within CS and to some extent to research areas outside of it. And I think these are things you can learn. So when you're getting started, it's very hard to say, oh, what's a giant impactful idea? But it's not too hard to say, how do I become better at like the core research skills? And so what I would recommend is like focusing on that aspect of things. And then the luck aspect of it is kind of out of your control, and you might want to just accept that. Finding the good idea, having that key insight, being in the right place at the right time, there's just this aspect of serendipity that you are not in control of for these things. And you have your good ideas, you have your big ideas at various points in your career, and what you want is to prepare yourself in two ways. One is by having those research skills ready. So by the time that research idea comes to you, that's the big idea that's going to be your big impactful contribution, you want it to be that everything else is automatic, that you know how to take that and execute on it and run on it, and to give that idea the to be a good advocate for that idea in the broader marketplace of ideas. The other thing is you need to be sort of open to finding those ideas and giving yourself the space to actually go and explore them, right? Like for me, this was like in a very real way when I chose to sort of shift into alignment. This was a new research area. It was something that like other people hadn't really studied. It was open, but it had like a certain intuitive appeal to me. There was something I felt I understood about the problem that I could communicate. And you can't really choose when that moment happens, but you can say, be ready to allow yourself to shift these directions, to be ready to like take that thread in the back of your mind and kind of keep pulling on it, and then recognize when it's something that should move from like, ooh, an idle thought that's come to you regularly over the course of the last 3 weeks to something you're actually going to spend an afternoon or a day or a week on and really like take to a point of like testing with the world and reality testing of that idea of how good it is and how well it can actually work. And so I think you want to cultivate almost this aspect of like play and curiosity that frees you up to be able to follow these big ideas when they come to you with this kind of like business-like, machine-like quality of like, I can take a research idea and turn it into a paper over the course of a week if everything else is in place. And like, it's really the marriage of those two that allows you to take advantage of the moments when they arise. And so as a researcher getting started, my advice would be to spend your time sort of building these research skills and building your kind of core research contributions, and then preserving an aspect of curiosity and play that will allow you to have those serendipitous moments and to take them beyond idle thoughts and into actual concrete implementation and deployment in the world. When you think about AI alignment specifically and what to look at there, I think it's important to think about, one, understanding the existing field as it is. I would probably go back and try to look at the history and origins of the field. There's, I think, a lot of really interesting ideas that come up from the like 15-year or so history that we've been studying this problem. And if you come in sort of starting at 2020 or 2022, there's a chance that you might miss some of these broader shifts. I don't think this is a field that knows the answers to things. Yet it's still there's still the opportunity, and I think we will have some big shifts over time. I think the other piece of this is to recognize in alignment specifically, one of the things that it calls out is that there's a notion of what are we trying to do that is fundamental and unavoidable. So I think in machine learning and AI, a lot of people talk about quality. They talk about, oh, well, we want to make the system more accurate. We want to make it better. But for alignment, what is better actually is a core crucial question. And so I'm not sure that there are necessarily real answers. Like there are certain, the way I see this is there's a lot of different ways in which we could design AI systems. There are some things that everyone agrees on, which are just like we want the system to be better at. So hallucinations, I think, are a good example of this, of like an uncontroversially, just systems can improve by hallucinating less. But when we get into aspects of how the system should prioritize different things within an interaction, how much should the system focus on making sure that it clearly understands you versus getting things done quickly? That's a place where there isn't really a right answer, and you have to go up a level of abstraction to be talking about how do you identify this person's version of the correct answer, or this company's version of the correct answer, or this society's version of the correct answer. And so really, really challenging your own assumptions about what is ground truth and what is the actual sort of North Star that we're working towards, I think is something that's uncomfortable. But if you want to work in this space, you really do want to get comfortable with thinking about that and grappling with that uncertainty. And then the last piece that I think the field of alignment could really spend a lot more time thinking about is the broader societal infrastructure that supports alignable systems. So how do we have kind of good institutions and other kind of collective mechanisms that provide the information that that AI systems need in order to align with different goals, with different aspects of what we want? What is the infrastructure that we need for society to have trusted interactions between AI agents that can operate reliably on behalf of different people in society? And I think a lot of these questions of like, what is the co-design of society that we need in order for it to match AI agents well is a really interesting problem that I don't know the answer to, but I guess maybe I'm hoping one of your viewers will figure it out and we'll come up with some great ideas so that I can learn what the answer is.
Yeah, 100%. And on that note, thank you so much, Dylan, for all of your advice. This is all incredible. We are so excited to have the opportunity for people in the comments and just in general in our community to be able to like learn from your perspective, especially given your wealth of knowledge and alignment. And yeah, thanks so much for taking the time to do this. We really appreciate it.
It was a real pleasure to be here. I'm really grateful for the opportunity. And I guess the last thing I'll say is, I'm looking for PhD students. If you're really excited in AI and in particular AI alignment and want to talk about these things more, please look for my website or consider sending in an application.
Yeah, for sure. Yep. Definitely. If this podcast isn't enough to convince you to apply to MIT for a PhD, man, nothing else can. Nothing else can. Like you gotta do it. Dylan's a legend. And yeah, we'll have your email address. But yeah, I mean, the most effective way to apply is to just apply through the portal, and list them in your application. Have kind of a convincing idea as to why. But anyways, yeah, thank you so much for coming on, and yeah, really appreciate your time.
Thank you. I hope you have a great day.